So one day I was scrolling on YouTube and I saw that leftist YouTube atheist number 3899, Hunter Avallone, reacted to Redeem Zoomer's video, All Atheist Arguments Answered in 10 Minutes, and tried his best to make replies to said video. Spoiler, he didn't do too well, and most of his arguments either fall into some type of fallacy or are based on his lack of knowledge, based on a misunderstanding of a point, or are just poorly thought out and constructed arguments. Without further ado, let's get into this reaction inception of me reacting to Hunter Avallone reacting to Redeem Zoomer.
Pausing this probably like obnoxiously because I'm probably gonna have to interject like every 5 seconds because I have a feeling that there's gonna be a lot of dumb shit here, okay? So just brace yourselves. Let's go.
Atheists have a lot of arguments, but they never really think of anything new that the church hasn't had answers to for the past 2,000 years. So let's answer them. Religion causes wars.
Is it the church answering things, or is the church the one making the exact same arguments for thousands upon thousands of years? And so atheist arguments have roughly stayed the same.
The reason the church makes the same arguments is because atheists rarely ever debunk the arguments they make. Most atheist responses to arguments made by the church tend to be very lackluster, with the exception of a few, as this video will show.
Like, which one is it? Which one came first, right? The belief in God or the disbelief in God?
The belief in God. And your point is, exactly? Since atheists rarely come up with good arguments, the church hasn't really been pushed to make tons of new arguments. So for the most part, it's at a stalemate.
If you were born somewhere else, you wouldn't be a Christian. Okay, and if you were born somewhere else, you wouldn't be an atheist. Everyone's beliefs are shaped by their context. How do you
know? Because atheism is not really a belief in anything. It's a rejection of a belief. It's a disbelief in something that is usually presented to you.
Yes, Hunter. And that disbelief or rejection of a belief is usually pushed by certain factors in your life. The average atheist didn't become one because they sat down and thought everything out. They became atheists either because their church hurt them, they were so uneducated in arguments against atheism that a low-level Reddit or YouTube atheist and their arguments were able to convince them, or because they never understood their religion in the first place. In most cases, good arguments against God only serve to reinforce an idea they already had, or that was already growing thanks to different factors affecting their life. The fact of the matter is that you, Hunter, are an atheist because of whatever unique factors in your life push you that way. If those factors change, for instance, you were born into an Islamic country, maybe certain factors might fall in place to make you an atheist, but the chances of that happening are low, unless you live in Iran. But I digress. What I'm trying to say is that you are the product of the secularization of the United States. If you were in a country which had no secularization and you grew up religious, the probability is you'd be a theist.
Now, atheists will say atheism is just a proposition. Atheism and nihilism are completely different things. Yes, atheism is a proposition, but that influences your entire worldview. We can look at the Pew Research. Atheists are a group that tend to think the same way on social issue, on politics, on science, on history, because it is a worldview. We can group atheists as a group for the same reasons we can group Christians as a group. They are in the same worldview. Yes, they may have some small disagreements, but they are part of the same group.
So, odds are you'd be an atheist regardless of the religion.
There's no scientific proof that God exists. Well, by definition, science can only prove things inside the natural world, and by definition, God is something outside the natural world. So science can neither prove nor disprove God. There's no evidence of anything supernatural.
Okay, maybe science itself cannot disprove God per se. That's why I say also that God is a non-falsifiable claim. However, the fact that science, the fact that we have a metric called science that can test the natural world, but we have no such metric to test for anything outside the natural world.
We do have a metric to test outside the natural world. It's called philosophy. Morality does not exist inside the natural world and can't be tested or studied with science, and so we use a different metric to study and test morality and ethics, and that is philosophy. That's why people make the moral argument for God. However, most atheists work on a completely naturalistic worldview and throw out philosophy as a metric or as any type of base for arguments for God, thereby throwing out a good handful of arguments for God.
Doesn't mean that science proves God doesn't exist, but it does force me to ask, why do you believe something then? Why do you believe this thing then?
Because there's evidence for it. You might not agree with the evidence, you may think it is unreliable, but it is there. As I go into this video, you'll hear me saying this on repeat because he doesn't seem to get it.
There's no evidence of anything supernatural. Well, that's just not accurate. There are medically documented cases of people with demonic possession speaking in languages they don't know, for example, and people with...
There are people with schizophrenia who also are able to speak in languages that the other split personality might not understand. There are certain people, they've had people who have undergone brain issues where their brain is split and they have two separate personalities in their brain, and one side of their brain is religious and the other side of the brain is non-religious. How do you know this is demonic possession?
How do you know this is not demonic possession? Both of these things can be true. Both of these things can exist at the same time. It's not mutually exclusive. The main problem here is that Hunter is working off of a naturalistic worldview, i.e. that everything has a natural explanation and that the supernatural is not true or does not exist. However, I and other theists like Redeemed Zoomer believe that both the natural and supernatural exist, which allows for both of these things to coexist. So, Hunter really doesn't debunk Zoomer here. All that happens is that they have two different views of these situations because they have two different worldviews. Neither argument are completely convincing.
This could just be somebody going crazy. This is just like assuming.
near-death experiences getting information they never had access to. The Bible has contradictions. Okay, you think you found an apparent contradiction that the church hasn't known about for 2,000 years? Every apparent contradiction can be explained by understanding just a little bit of theology.
So no answer, just you go to church more. Go to church more, young squire.
Yes, Hunter, because that's how you learn about the Bible and biblical theology, Hunter. It's almost like the church is supposed to educate you on the religious text it's based on.
Oh my god! Wow!
Imagine how foolish it would sound if we replaced the Bible and theology with math and a math textbook in this situation. A Hunter mocks someone for going to math class to learn more about math and understand the equations in their textbook. If it is the case you want resources that address these quote-unquote contradictions, I'll be happy to provide links to them in the description.
The Gospels were anonymous. Okay, anonymous doesn't mean we have no idea who wrote them. It just means the names of the authors aren't signed in the text itself. But we literally have writings from church fathers who knew the apostles and can verify that they indeed wrote the books named after them.
Who cares if they were anonymous or not? The better question is, why do we care what these randos and their anecdotes are? Why do we care about that? That's the real question there.
It isn't 100% clear who he's talking about here, whether it is the church fathers or the apostles themselves, but I'll respond to both. In the case of the church fathers, we should care because these people were either the disciples of the apostles or the disciples of the apostles, meaning that they either knew the apostles who wrote the books or they knew the disciples of the apostles who wrote the books, making their opinion credible. This is because they either would have been trained by the eyewitnesses themselves or would have had access to the eyewitnesses of the events recorded in the gospel. In the case that he's referring to the apostles, we should care because these people walked with Jesus for 3 years. They were the first-hand eyewitnesses of Jesus' ministry and the last 3 years of his life. If we can't trust these people, we have no reason to trust any other historical document written. So in order to debunk the Bible, you end up debunking all of history. Come on, Hunter. You can do better than this.
The later one of the Gospels was written, the more divine it makes Jesus seem, so we can extrapolate that Jesus was originally a human figure who got made more divine over time. Alright, maybe some Gospels emphasize Jesus' divinity more than others, but what about Paul's letters that fully confess the divinity of Jesus and were also written before any of the Gospels?
I honestly haven't really heard any of these arguments before. I hope we get to some better ones soon. Wait a minute, is he doing that thing where he makes up the fake argument to debunk it and look really smart and big-brained?
No, he's not. The reason you haven't heard these arguments is because your knowledge of arguments against Christianity is still at Reddit level. If it wasn't, you know that New Testament scholars like Bart Ehrman, as well as many other better educated and knowledgeable atheists, have made this argument. This is only the beginning of Hunter being a great example of the Dunning-Kruger effect. In trying to insult Redeemed Zoomer, he has shown how little he knows in the realm of anti-Christian argumentations.
So that breaks your pattern. The Bible supports slavery. No, it doesn't. Just because there's slavery in the Bible doesn't mean the Bible supports it. There are some Old Testament verses that could be interpreted as condoning slavery, but Jesus himself said that the Old Testament made accommodations to people's sinful state. And also, slave owners in the American South had slave Bibles for their slaves to read, but it omitted a lot of the real Bible, so if the Bible actually did support slavery, this wouldn't have been necessary. Christianity...
So Jesus himself admitted that God, his Father, who is supposed to be all-knowing and all-perfect and all-moral, made accommodations for people's sinful state? If God could make accommodations for people's sinful state, then why the did Jesus ever even have to die on the cross?
Another lovely example of Hunter's lack of knowledge when it comes to any sort of theology. Hunter, God making accommodations for people's sinful state, is not talking about allowing them into heaven. It refers to God working with humans on earth, specifically the nation of Israel. God was working with them to bring forth Jesus, the Messiah, so that he could die for the sins of the world. If you've read any part of the Old Testament after the Exodus, you'd know that the Israelites were a group of stiff-necked, hard-headed, stubborn people who God had to punish constantly for their actions. It was these people who God chose to work with, and because of this, he made accommodations or concessions to continue working with them so that he could get them to a better point morally. Hunter, you're a father. If I remember correctly, from when they used to follow you, your daughter should be around the age of 4. Let's say your daughter Rose wants ice cream or cake for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but you, as her father, knows that this is not good for her and you want to get her to a better point where she's more favorable towards fruits, vegetables, and better constructed meals. Would you A. give up on working with her and turn your back on her because she doesn't do everything you say when you say it? Or B, make accommodations to her sweet tooth by allowing her to have a slice of cake or a scoop of ice cream every once in a while after she eats her meal, even if it isn't the ideal situation, in order to get her to a better one. The situation between God and the Israelites is similar to that. You're so confident in topics you're so ignorant on. This clip from Inspiring Philosophy helps to explain what I'm getting at here.
If you read through the Torah, you will find some verses that appear pretty awful. The death penalty is applied for minor offenses, or things that don't seem worthy of death to us. Israelites are allowed to keep slaves, and women are not on an equal level with men. Skeptics often bring up these verses to show there are horrible things permitted in the Bible. So the Word of God contains some pretty immoral ideas. But seeking to defend the Bible, Christians often attempt to offer explanations for why we are misunderstanding these passages based on the cultural context or what the original Hebrew meant. But then skeptics often reply that it is the Christians who are misunderstanding what the passages are saying. So, as a Christian, I propose a compromise. Let's just say the skeptics are right. The Torah does contain numerous passages that contain immoral ideas, but also, God admits the Torah was never meant to be a perfect moral code. To begin, I want to point out this is part 2 of a series. So much of what I say here will be building on this previous video, where we point out the Torah was not a prescriptive law code or legislation. It was more akin to didactic wisdom literature, and was set up as a suzerain treaty. But why would God still allow the Torah to contain verses that appear to be okay with slavery or treating women as second-class citizens? Well, we need to remember, the Bible implies in many places that the Torah was not a perfect moral code from God. It contained concessions for stiff-necked Israel, and God even admits this. First, in Matthew 19, the Pharisees come and attempt to trick Jesus by asking him a question about the law of divorce. They ask why Moses allowed them to give a certificate of divorce and send their wives away. But Jesus replies, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so." This is a very important point made by Jesus. The law of divorce only existed because the hearts of the ancient Israelites were hard. God only allowed this for the time being because Israel was not at a point yet where they could be given more ethical marriage guidelines. Considering scholars note the Torah was to be understood holistically and not as individual sections, this implies some of what is in the Torah was included due to a compromise between God and Israel here.
Okay, if God could have just accommodated for my sinful state, why is he too much of a pussy to be in my presence because I'm sinful?
You have that the other way around.
What? The whole thing is that God cannot accommodate for sin. God cannot be around sin. He can't stand it. He detests it. That is the whole thing with God. That's why he had to send Jesus Christ, to build the bridge between us and our sinful ways so that we could be with God and seek repentance. That's the whole gospel. So if God was able to just accommodate for sinful states, then we never needed to have the gospel to begin with.
Wrong again, Hunter. You're literally just talking out of your ass here. Like I said before multiple times in the video, Hunter just takes what is being said, misunderstands it, makes a point based on that misunderstanding and runs with it, which makes his whole point easy for me to debunk because his point isn't even true, it's based on a falsehood. So like I said, you're wrong, Hunter.
Second of all, it literally is God himself saying that you can get slaves and it's okay to beat them. Like, it's God deliberately saying this. Now, maybe he's going to say, well, the Bible was written by men, so maybe it was a mistake, you know? Oh, well, if you can't decide which words were from God and which weren't, then I think we can just disregard this.
Christianity supported slavery. Well, sure, some Christians did, but all human civilizations have had slavery. Christian civilization was the first one to abolish it on moral grounds. The fact that you're against slavery is due to Christian influence. Also, most
Whether it is or isn't is literally irrelevant to me. So let me tell you something. If somebody believes that aliens used their magic fairy dust to create humans, and that's why humans are really special, okay? Because this fairy dust is limited. There's a limited supply of this fairy dust, and so these aliens created humans using fairy dust. And because we were made with this limited thing, that gives us immense value. And because of this, now I am motivated to build hospitals, accommodate for people, and fight against slavery. All of these things are good, but it doesn't mean that aliens really did create us out of fairy dust. So just if the belief inspired some good outcomes, doesn't mean that the belief itself is true, or even good, or even right.
The argument being made here is not because Christianity abolished slavery, therefore God real. The argument being made here is specifically against the argument that Christianity has supported slavery. Come on, Hunter, you're supposed to be a debater. You gotta be able to pick up on stuff like this. I mean, for crying out loud, it's right there on the screen. I can't tell if he's being purposefully deceptive or if he's just that ignorant.
It just means that you made it to the right conclusion.
Also, most organizations fighting modern-day slavery are Christian. God killed tons of people.
Well, yeah, that's because they have to make up for the past. Got him.
In the Bible. Well, it's actually way more than that. God numbers everyone's days. He's the giver of life, so he can take it, especially if people sin.
Because God gave life, he can take it? Okay, literally by that definition, my parents should have the right to murder me.
Blatant false equivalency. God and your mother are not the same, Hunter. This shouldn't even need to be stated. Your right atheism is showing. Your mother gives you life by giving birth to you. God gives you life by breathing his very breath into you. He's the one who sustains you even as you curse and scorn him. That gives him every right to take your life when or as he sees fit.